In the depths of that limestone cave on Okinawa, the air hung thick with the scent of wet stone and collective terror. 23 women breathed as quietly as they could manage in the oppressive August heat of 1945, their bodies compressed against the rough walls as if they might disappear into the rock itself. Among them sat Keiko Yamada, her fingers wrapped so tightly around a stolen surgical scalpel that the metal bit into her palm. At 28 years old, she'd spent her peaceful days before the war guiding young students through the delicate art of calligraphy, teaching them to form characters with precision and care. Those days belonged to a different lifetime now. In the darkness, she studied the faces surrounding her, committing each one to memory as if this might be their final hour together. Blood had dried into stiff patches on the nurses' white aprons. The youngest among them, girls barely past childhood, still clutched the rice bowls they'd carried from the kitchens before everything collapsed. 4 elderly women sat apart from the others, their silence carrying the weight of experiences none of them would ever speak aloud, horrors they'd endured before soldiers transported them to this island of fire and death. The artillery barrage had ceased. Somehow that absence of sound created more dread than the constant shelling had. Silence meant proximity. It meant the enemy had arrived and was hunting through the caves. Keiko had absorbed every frame of those propaganda reels, watched them until the images burned into her consciousness. American soldiers depicted as literal demons, fangs dripping with blood, claws tearing through flesh, creatures that devoured children and violated women with savage pleasure. She pressed harder against the cave wall, trying to summon the prayers her mother had taught her during childhood, but her mind had gone blank with fear. The words refused to form. Then came the footsteps, echoing off stone with deliberate slowness. Harsh English voices carried into the cave, their guttural tones matching exactly what the training films had promised. But what happened next shattered every expectation. A voice speaking Japanese floated through the darkness. The accent was foreign, certainly, but the words were clear and gentle. "Please come out. You are safe here." The women froze in collective disbelief. Standing at the mouth of the cave, framed by afternoon light, was a man in full American military uniform. His hands were visible, deliberately positioned away from his weapon. The rifle pointed harmlessly at the ground. He looked young, perhaps Keiko's own age, with brown hair and exhausted eyes that held no malice. No horns protruded from his skull. No fangs distorted his mouth. He was simply tall, wearing enemy colours, and holding a white cloth in one hand while offering a canteen of water with the other. Keiko saw him first. Her brain struggled to reconcile the reality before her eyes with everything she'd been taught to expect, everything she'd been told about the barbarians who would torture them before death. The other women began creeping forward from the shadows, their bodies skeletal from months of inadequate rations, their movements hesitant and limping. They covered their faces instinctively, as though somehow that small gesture might shield them from whatever brutality was coming. They emerged into the late afternoon sunshine, anticipating violence, preparing themselves mentally for the atrocities they'd been promised would happen. Instead, American medics moved toward them with extraordinary care. A young private removed his own jacket and draped it gently across the shoulders of an elderly woman whose torn kimono barely covered her body. Another soldier, his face covered in freckles that stood out against his sunburned skin, knelt directly in the dirt without hesitation to wrap clean bandages around a girl's badly infected foot. His touch remained gentle throughout, almost apologetic in its tenderness. The tall soldier who'd called them out stepped closer to Keiko and spoke again in his accented Japanese. "It's okay. Everything will be all right." Then he placed something solid into her open palm. When she looked down, she found herself holding a chocolate bar, its wrapper printed with English words she could read but absolutely could not trust. Monsters did not carry Hershey's chocolate. Demons did not offer water and speak gentle words. For 3 hours that felt suspended outside normal time, the makeshift camp operated like something from an impossible dream. Hot soup materialized in metal cups that burned their cold fingers. Clean white bandages replaced the filthy rags they'd been using for weeks. An older doctor with silver threading through his dark hair performed a respectful bow before examining each patient, waiting explicitly for permission before laying hands on anyone. Keiko observed the Americans working with the same careful attention she'd once devoted to evaluating her students' calligraphy exercises. They looked bored with the routine, almost casual about it, like rescuing enemy women was just another task to complete before their evening meal, nothing remarkable or extraordinary about it. She allowed herself to believe, for those 3 fragile hours, that perhaps they might actually survive this war. When night settled over the island, the soldiers erected a tent specifically for the women, positioned at a distance from the men's quarters. Guards stood watch, but the atmosphere felt surprisingly comfortable rather than threatening. Keiko stretched out on an actual cot for the first time in 2 years, feeling canvas beneath her back instead of cold stone or wet mud. Her body should have relaxed into sleep. Instead, she lay rigid, every muscle tense, waiting for this pleasant dream to transform into the nightmare she'd been promised. Then voices drifted through the canvas walls. 2 American soldiers talking just outside, their conversation carrying clearly through the thin fabric. Those poor girls. Most of them were forced into those comfort stations, you know. Did you see the bruises covering that older woman? Those aren't from us. Yeah. The Imperial Army did that to them. Their own people did that. Keiko's stomach transformed into ice. She knew about the comfort stations. Everyone knew, though speaking openly about them remained forbidden. But every piece of propaganda had insisted it was the Americans who dishonored women, the Americans who committed unspeakable atrocities against female prisoners. Not one officer, not a single general, had ever warned them about what their own military was doing to women like the silent ones sleeping in the tent's corner right now. She lay there in darkness, still gripping the chocolate bar she hadn't eaten yet, and felt her entire understanding of the world beginning to fracture. If the Americans weren't the monsters, then who was? If the enemy could demonstrate mercy and compassion, what did that make the empire she'd devoted herself to serving? The questions felt dangerous, like deliberately touching an exposed electrical wire. But Keiko had been a teacher once, trained to follow logical arguments to their conclusions regardless of how uncomfortable the truth might prove. 3 days passed, and the prisoner of war camp settled into a rhythm that felt increasingly stable. Tents stood in precise rows, field kitchens sent smoke spiraling into the humid tropical air, and barbed wire marked boundaries more for appearance than actual security. Not a single person had attempted escape. Where would they possibly go? Sergeant Daniel Nakamura became the essential bridge connecting 2 completely different worlds. He translated words, certainly, but more importantly, he mediated the countless small misunderstandings that could escalate dangerously if left unaddressed. He taught the American soldiers not to touch women without clear warning first, not to raise their voices even when excited, not to assume that silence indicated consent or comfort. He taught the Japanese women that meal times weren't elaborate tricks, that the guards weren't searching for excuses to hurt them, that requesting medicine or an extra blanket wouldn't result in punishment or abuse. The work exhausted him completely. Every single conversation required him to stand in the space between fear and good intention, translating not merely words but entire incompatible worldviews. At night, alone inside his tent, he would remove the identification card from Manzanar internment camp and study his own face looking back at him from behind barbed wire. He understood intimately what it meant to be perceived as the enemy by people who spoke your language. Yuki Tanaka was the first woman to cross that invisible boundary separating them. She was 19 years old and couldn't read written words, but she'd memorized every recipe her grandmother had ever taught her. On the 4th morning, she simply appeared at the entrance to the American kitchen and started working without asking anyone's permission. She picked up a knife and began chopping vegetables with the practiced efficiency of someone raised to feed large families on minimal resources. Corporal James Lewis glanced up from the field stove, and their eyes met across the space. He was 34, originally from Georgia, and his mother had taught him that you could understand everything important about a person by observing how they treated food. This Japanese girl treated the wilted cabbage and bruised potatoes with the same careful respect he gave to Sunday dinner preparations back home. He held up a bag of cornmeal and gestured, trying to communicate across the language barrier. "You know cornbread." Then he realized she probably understood no English at all. He pantomimed mixing ingredients, measuring and stirring. Yuki shook her head, but watched with complete attention as he measured and combined ingredients. When he pulled the golden squares from the oven and offered her one, she tasted it and smiled for the first time since her capture. Then she gestured for rice and dried seaweed and showed him how to fold perfect onigiri, the rice balls shaped with precise movements of her small hands. They worked together after that initial connection, communicating through the universal language of cooking and food preparation. Other small moments began accumulating like rainfall, slowly filling an empty cup. An American nurse named Sarah Brennan demonstrated how to braid hair using colourful new ribbons she'd purchased with her own money. Daniel translated letters the women wrote to family members, though most would never reach their destinations because the people they addressed had died in the firebombings. Keiko watched an American medic cry openly when a Japanese child from a nearby village died of malnutrition in the camp hospital. She'd never imagined enemies could weep for your losses. The emotional peak arrived when a photographer from Life magazine visited the compound. The women felt terrified initially, remembering how propaganda cameras transformed every image into a weapon. But this photographer was different. He requested permission through Daniel's translations. He bowed respectfully. He waited patiently. When he finally raised his camera, it was to capture Yuki and Corporal Lewis laughing together over a shared meal, their hands busy with food, their expressions genuinely relaxed and happy. That evening, Keiko sat inside her tent with the stolen notebook she still carried everywhere. She wrote in careful Japanese characters, then whispered the words aloud to herself. "They're so tall and handsome, not monsters at all." She'd meant the observation only for herself, but Yuki overheard and smiled in agreement. "The black one, Louis-san, he reminds me of my uncle." Same laugh exactly. Daniel was passing by the tent entrance, making his evening rounds and checking on everyone. He caught the tail end of Keiko's whispered confession and paused outside. His expressions softened into something sad and deeply knowing. He understood precisely what they'd been told about Americans. He knew because his own government had labelled him a security risk and locked his entire family behind wire at Manzanar simply for having faces that matched the propaganda posters. He didn't interrupt their conversation. He simply continued walking, allowing them this moment of truth spoken privately in darkness. Some realizations were too fragile to acknowledge directly. They needed time to properly take root. By the third week, daily life in the camp had developed a rhythm that almost felt normal. Morning roll call, followed by breakfast. Work details that allowed the women to feel useful rather than helpless and dependent. Evening meals where Japanese and American food appeared side by side on metal trays. The barbed wire remained standing, but it had transformed into more symbol than actual barrier. Nobody wanted to leave anymore. Plans were beginning to form for the future. A Red Cross representative arrived carrying official paperwork and gentle reassurances. The women would be transferred to a civilian resettlement facility in Yokohama within the month. Serious efforts would be made to locate surviving family members. Those with marketable skills would be offered work helping with reconstruction efforts. The representative, a tired-looking woman from Michigan with genuinely kind eyes, spoke through Daniel and promised that nobody would be abandoned or forgotten. Keiko was offered a position as an official translator. The Red Cross desperately needed Japanese speakers who understood both languages and both cultures with real depth. She accepted the offer before she'd fully processed what it meant, that someone saw value in her beyond her capacity to follow orders obediently, that her skills actually mattered to someone, that she had a legitimate future beyond simply surviving one more day. The quiet evenings became hers and Daniel's by unspoken mutual agreement. They sat outside the medical tent where a single electric bulb provided enough light to read by. She taught him proper formal Japanese, the honorific language that required thinking 3 steps ahead about hierarchy and social respect. He taught her American slang that made absolutely no grammatical sense but somehow communicated perfectly anyway. "You're a good egg," he said one night, attempting to explain the idiom. "An egg?" Keiko frowned at him in confusion. "This is supposed to be a compliment? A good person, someone trustworthy and reliable. Then why not simply say trustworthy?" Daniel laughed, and the sound surprised them both. Laughter had been rare in this place, nearly extinct. "Because Americans enjoy making things unnecessarily complicated," he admitted. "Japanese people also do this," Keiko confessed. "We have 17 different ways to say thank you, depending entirely on who is speaking to whom." It wasn't romance, though some of the younger American soldiers whispered about the translator and the pretty nurse spending so much time together. It was something deeper and more significant than mere attraction. Mutual respect between two people who understood what it meant to exist between worlds, never fully belonging to either one. Daniel carried his internment camp identification in his left pocket like a protective talisman. Keiko carried her stolen notebook filled with observations she was only beginning to understand. They recognized something essential in each other that required no explanation or justification. The week turned golden when news arrived specifically for Yuki. A Red Cross worker had successfully located her younger brother in a hospital in Tokyo. He'd survived the bombing of their village, had been found wandering through the ruins by American soldiers, and was recovering from severe malnutrition and a broken leg. The message included a note written in her brother's careful handwriting. "Yuki Nisan, are you still alive somewhere?" Yuki stood in the middle of the camp holding that letter and cried for the first time since her capture. Great heaving sobs that bent her small body double with emotion. Corporal Lewis appeared with a clean handkerchief and said absolutely nothing, just stood nearby in case she needed something solid to hold on to. Keiko held her tightly until the crying subsided into hiccups and then quiet breathing. "He's alive," Yuki whispered through her tears. "I still have family." The words spread through the women's tent like sunrise breaking over water. If Yuki's brother had survived, perhaps others had too. Perhaps the cities weren't entirely reduced to ash and memory. Perhaps home still existed somewhere beyond the barbed wire and the ocean and the propaganda that had shaped their understanding of everything. For one golden week, the future felt genuinely possible. The women began imagining lives beyond mere survival. The older ones spoke quietly about finding their children, about rebuilding what had been destroyed. The younger ones wondered aloud about learning new trades, about teaching, about nursing, about contributing something meaningful. Keiko found herself sketching actual plans in her notebook, not just observations of trauma, but real plans for living. Where she might live, how she would use her language skills, whether she could help other women navigate the occupation successfully. Daniel watched the transformation with something that might have been hope growing in his chest. He'd witnessed terrible things during this war. Bodies stacked like firewood waiting to burn. Entire villages reduced to smoking craters in the earth. The casual cruelty that men inflicted when they stopped seeing each other as human beings. But he'd also witnessed this. Mercy extended deliberately across enemy lines. Dignity restored through small, consistent kindnesses, the stubborn resilience of people who refused to let war steal their capacity for trust. One evening, as he and Keiko sat practicing verb conjugations under the single electric bulb, she looked up from her notebook and spoke carefully. Thank you for teaching us that not all Americans are monsters. Daniel met her eyes directly. Thank you for teaching us that not all Japanese are fanatics willing to die for nothing. Neither one spoke the deeper truth that connected them, that both had been required to prove their fundamental humanity to governments that doubted it, that both carried scars from being perceived as threats by their own people. But the understanding passed between them anyway, silent and absolutely complete. The week ended with quiet optimism settling over the camp like morning mist over water. Nobody said the word hope aloud. It still felt too fragile to name directly. The order arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a nervous villager who refused to meet anyone's eyes directly. A group of imperial officers, hardline fanatics who refused to accept the surrender, had retreated deep into caves in the northern mountains. They'd heard specific reports about the prisoners. They'd heard about the women who smiled at Americans, who cooked their food, who accepted their medicine without resistance. The message was brief and absolutely clear. Any woman who collaborates with the enemy is a traitor to the emperor. When we restore proper order, justice will be served accordingly. The threat didn't specify what form justice might take. It didn't need to. Every woman in the camp understood the weight of that word, the violence it carried, the shame it promised. They'd all witnessed what happened to women accused of dishonoring their families or their nation. Some fates were worse than simple death. Yuki stopped coming to the kitchen entirely. She sat in the tent with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, staring at nothing. Corporal Lewis appeared at the entrance twice carrying rice balls wrapped in clean cloth, but she wouldn't accept them or even acknowledge his presence. The older women retreated back into the silence they'd carried since the very beginning, their faces closed like windows being shuttered against a storm. Keiko watched everything she'd carefully built over 3 weeks, all that fragile trust and tentative hope, crumble like ash in her hands. Then Takeshi Mori made everything significantly worse. He was a civilian translator the Americans had hired from a nearby town, a man approximately 40 years old with cold calculating eyes and a leather-bound ledger he carried absolutely everywhere. He claimed to be keeping records for the occupation authorities, carefully documenting who had been in the camp and what assistance they'd received. But Keiko recognized the truth in how he positioned himself strategically at meal lines and in doorways, recording every interaction, every name, every smile exchanged. He wasn't building evidence for American tribunals. He was compiling evidence for Japanese ones that would come later. She confronted him directly in Japanese, keeping her voice low and controlled. "What exactly are you doing?" Takeshi looked up from his ledger with something resembling amusement. "My job. Recording the truth accurately. The truth for whose benefit? For whoever controls Japan when this temporary occupation ends. The Americans won't stay here forever, and when Japanese governance returns, these records will matter enormously." He tapped his pen against the page deliberately. Collaboration has serious consequences. Daniel overheard the conversation from across the compound and approached quickly, his face tight with controlled anger. "You're threatening them." "I'm simply documenting facts," Takeshi replied in English, then switched back to Japanese for emphasis. "You think you're one of them, Nakamura? You're as much a traitor as these whores who smile at enemy soldiers." Daniel's fist connected with Takeshi's face before he'd consciously decided to throw the punch. The sound was sharp and satisfying. Takeshi dropped his precious ledger, blood streaming from his broken nose. 2 American MPs pulled Daniel off before he could hit him again. The damage was done, though. The women had heard the exchange and understood perfectly. Their names were being recorded. Their small kindnesses were being catalogued as evidence. Going home meant facing judgment from their own people for the crime of accepting mercy. The camp chaplain tried earnestly to help. He was a gentle soul from Ohio who spoke no Japanese whatsoever, but had kind, weathered hands and a genuine smile. Through a different translator, he told the women that the war was over. that those mountain officers had no real power anymore, that they would be protected. But Keiko knew better. Power wasn't about armies anymore. It was about how tight-knit villages policed themselves when honor was questioned. She'd personally witnessed women stoned for lesser offences than smiling at an enemy soldier. The transfer to Yokohama, which had seemed like salvation just days ago, now felt like a death sentence. Once their names appeared on official Red Cross documents, once they returned to Japanese society, there would be no hiding what they'd done. That evening, Keiko stood at the fence line, watching the ocean turn deep purple in the fading light. She heard footsteps approaching behind her and knew without turning that it was Daniel. He stood beside her in silence for a long moment before speaking. "They're releasing me with a formal reprimand. Apparently a broken nose isn't worth a full court-martial." Keiko said nothing, just kept staring at the darkening water. "The transfer is still scheduled for next week. Nothing's changed officially." "I don't know how to go home anymore," Keiko whispered. The words came out broken, like something being torn rather than spoken naturally. Daniel stared at that same impossible ocean horizon. His hands gripped the fence wire until his knuckles turned white. Neither do I. 2 days passed in heavy, oppressive silence. The women held a private meeting without any American presence, speaking in whispers inside their tent. By unanimous decision, they formally requested to stay in the camp indefinitely. They would rather live as prisoners of war than face what waited outside the wire. Better to be captives than traitors. Better to have no home than to return to one that would reject them completely. The American command was utterly baffled by this request. The Red Cross representative returned with increasingly desperate reassurances, but Daniel translated the women's fear in terms the Americans couldn't quite grasp. How could he explain that mercy itself had become dangerous, that every act of kindness had marked them as collaborators, that in a nation desperately rebuilding its honor, these women would be convenient scapegoats for everyone's shame? Keiko spent one morning teaching the American nurses how to care for Japanese patients, not just medically, but culturally. How to preserve dignity when performing examinations. How to avoid shame when discussing bodily functions. How to understand that silence didn't always mean consent or comfort. Sometimes it simply meant the absence of safe words to express what you actually felt. It was all she had left to give. If she couldn't save herself, perhaps she could teach others how to see the humanity in people the world had decided were expendable. Yuki stopped eating entirely. She sat in the tent, holding her brother's letter, reading the same 5 lines over and over, even though she couldn't actually read the characters. Keiko had read it aloud so many times that Yuki had memorized the sounds perfectly. The older women prepared quietly for death, not from violence, but from despair. They'd survived the war only to be defeated by the prospect of peace. Then, on the 3rd day, a letter arrived. Not from Japan, from America. A Japanese-American community group in Los Angeles, many of them former internees from Manzanar and other camps, had been reading newspaper accounts of the prisoner of war camps. They'd started a sponsorship program. Any Japanese woman who wished to emigrate could apply. New names if needed. New lives, work permits, housing assistance, churches and community centres ready to help with everything. Daniel's mother, Fumiko Nakamura, was on the organising committee. The letter included a photograph. A dozen Nisei women standing in front of a white church holding a banner written in both English and Japanese. "You are not alone." Keiko stared at that photograph for 10 full minutes without moving at all. These were women who had been imprisoned by their own government for having the wrong faces. They'd lost homes, businesses, entire lives. And now they were offering sanctuary to women who had been technical enemies just months ago. Not all the women chose to accept. Some decided to face Japan, to find their families, to reclaim their names despite the enormous cost. Courage wore many different faces, and some of those faces looked like returning home even when home promised only judgment and pain. Keiko understood that choice completely. She respected it deeply. But Yuki applied immediately. So did 6 others. Keiko hesitated for 2 full days before writing her application in careful English. In the required essay explaining why she wanted to emigrate, she included the line that had become her fundamental truth. They're so tall and handsome, not monsters at all. And if they aren't monsters, maybe I'm not either. 6 weeks later, San Francisco Harbor emerged from the fog like a painting, slowly coming into focus. Keiko stood on the deck of the transport ship, gripping the railing with both hands until her fingers ached. Yuki stood beside her, clutching a piece of paper on which Corporal Lewis had written his cornbread recipe in careful block letters. The other women gathered close, their bodies instinctively seeking the safety of the group, even as the future opened before them, like a door they'd never imagined walking through. Daniel waited on the dock below. He wore civilian clothes, grey slacks and a simple shirt, no uniform to mark him as soldier or translator or anything except a man who had survived. He held a sign with their names written in both English and Japanese characters. Beside him stood Fumiko Nakamura, his mother. She was small, grey-haired, with eyes that assessed everything and hands that never stopped moving. When the women descended the gangplank on shaking legs, Fumiko bowed deeply. Keiko bowed back, matching the depth and duration exactly according to proper form. "Welcome home," Fumiko said in Japanese. Keiko wanted to correct her. This wasn't home. Home was a village that no longer existed, a school where she'd once taught, a life that had been burned to ash. But then she saw the other women waiting behind Fumiko, former internees carrying baskets of food and blankets, offering spare rooms in their apartments. Women who understood what it meant to be seen as the enemy by people who spoke your language. Women who had chosen to build sanctuary because they knew exactly what it felt like to have none. Keiko understood then that home wasn't a place. It was the people who chose to see your dignity when the world said you had none. That night, in a small room above a church in Japantown, Keiko wrote a letter to the women who had stayed in Japan. She didn't know if it would ever arrive. Mail between former enemies was uncertain at best. But she wrote anyway, because some truths needed to be spoken even into silence. She wrote carefully, "I was taught to fear the foreigners. I was taught they were demons incarnate. But I learned something on Okinawa. The only monsters are the ones we create with our lies. I don't know if I'll ever stop being afraid, but I know I'll never stop telling the truth." She sealed the envelope, addressed it to names that might no longer exist, to villages that might be nothing but ruins now. But she walked to the post office the next morning and sent it anyway. Because small truths, like small kindnesses, had a way of surviving war.